We're back to this. We're back to me awkwardly standing in front of a camera and you hopefully comfortably sitting at home. And on Friday, as everybody tuned in to hear what is going to happen, there was a sigh of relief across our nation as it was announced that the rest of New Zealand would not go past level 2 lockdown, and the rest of us in Auckland, this big, bright, vibrant city, would stay in level 3 lockdown for just a few more days. 14 in total, not 57 or ongoing or maybe someday in the future. And this simple announcement of a timeline gave us hope. It gave us hope to say that it's not going to be that bad. Hope that we can do this. Hope that whatever is happening in New Zealand due to COVID, it can't be that bad if the government's going to let us go shopping in 2 weeks Wednesday. But Violet Crawley, the Dowager Countess of the imaginary downtown Abbey, said this: "Hope is a tease designed to prevent us from accepting reality." Now, I have no idea in what context she said this. I have never watched the show. But I can't imagine this situation was when everything was happy and bright, when they were having tea and pickle sandwiches on the main lawn in the glorious Sunday afternoon summer sun. I can imagine this conversation and this quip being given in a time where there was some holding out of hope. Something had gone terribly wrong and maybe someone was dead in the war? I don't know. Maybe I should watch it. Hope is a tease designed to prevent us from accepting reality. And as I read and sit in Lamentations more and more, I'm beginning to think she's right. As we hope against hope for whatever, fill in your own blank, the end of COVID in New Zealand, more beautiful sunny days, the Chiefs maybe one day winning a rugby match, it does protect us from a certain reality that is very much uglier than what we are hoping to happen. And 3 weeks ago, we started with Lamentations because as people, we don't know what to do with grief and frustrations. We don't know what to do with the heartbreak of this world. We don't know where to put God or what to do with Jesus. What to do with that statement that he made on the cross when he said it is finished. And with this picture of Revelation 21 and 22, it sits so reassuringly at the end of our scriptures, giving us so much comfort. Of that day when the end would come and all things would be made new and there would be no more pain and no more crying. It's hard to fathom such a thing when we have been sitting for so long in Lamentations, where there doesn't seem to be the hope of Revelation, where there doesn't seem to be the finish of Jesus, where God himself seems absent. We sit in Lamentations in a paradox of pain and promise because we need to learn how to do it. It is a never-ending wandering. It is a wrestle of our minds, our hearts, and our souls to begin to comprehend how we do this. Because we are so good at holding on to hope to protect us from the reality of our world. And if you had been reading through the poems in order, we are now up to the middle. This is the third and the longest. And it is for the first time the voice of one individual. Just one individual as he works out and wrestles with what he knows about God's character, what has happened in his world, and how far the gap is between the two. 3 is the longest of the poems, and a fair chunk of it is pain and anguish that cannot be ignored. It cannot be wished away. Lamentations 3 verse 1. I am one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Against me alone he turns his hand again and again all day long. He has made my flesh and skin waste away and broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled about me so I cannot escape, and he has put heavy chains on me. And though I cry for help, he shuts out my prayers. He has blocked my ways with hewn stones, and he has made my path crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He has led me off the way and torn me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a mark for his arrow. He has shot into my vitals the arrows of his quiver, and I have become a laughingstock of all my people, the object of their taunt songs all day long. And he has filled me with bitterness. He has glutted me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on the gravel and me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and all that I hope for from the Lord. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. Have you caught the wrestle? If you think of Psalm 23, when you think of this great shepherd who was to lead Israel, this great shepherd that King David spoke of, who would be the one who prepared a way forward, a one who makes a table in the presence of enemies, the one who would bring goodness and mercy all the days of their life. We now have a shepherd who is not a shepherd, but is actually a bear who lies in wait, or a lion or is hiding, or one who makes paths crooked. The lamenter says, God, you said this, and I know this to be true, but you're not that now. What do I do with this? What do I do with this gap between what seems to be your faithfulness and character then to what's happening now? Here is honest communication with God by one of his servants, one of his people, as he tries to figure this out. As he figures out his world and his expectation of God, he sees that his experience is not good. He is overwhelmed in the presence of darkness. He is in deep physical pain. He is imprisoned under external threats of violence. And most crippling, there is this loss of hope. In verse 18, so I say to myself, gone is my glory, and all that I hoped for from the Lord. The lamenter looks around and is overwhelmed. And then perhaps this bit that you have been waiting for. Perhaps you've read through or ahead when you've been following the reading plan, and you've got to this bit and you have sighed with relief, because there is this bit about hope. This bit about hope makes it the longest of all the five. We finally relax a little bit because we know it's going to be okay. We know it's all going to get fixed. My soul continually thinks of this and is bowed down within me, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. Hope. This is the bit that we get most excited in the book of Lamentations, because this is the bit that we know what to do with the most. We don't know what to do with God not seeming to be God's character. And we don't know what to do with a city that was once proud that's now destroyed. We don't know what to do with the homelessness. We don't know what to do with the desecration. But hope we are comfortable with, hope we can hang on to and say, yes. And we should. But it's a struggle. Because hope doesn't fix it all. This is only the middle of chapter 3 or poem 3. There are still the rest of this chapter, all of 4 where we hear about mothers eating babies, and 5 where it ends with basically, but maybe you've just forgotten us. Hope is good, but it doesn't mean that everything is right, and it can't be the only thing that we cling on to. Hope is good. Let me say that again, because I am not averse to it. I love it. And this hope in particular, not I hope my washing doesn't get wet, or I hope the Chiefs finally win the game, but hope in what we know is good and true and secure is the best hope we can ever find. And this hope that the lamenter talks about is the best and truest and purest of all the hopes. It is found in the fidelity of God, the essentialness of, that is essential of his character, and that is himself. If you know about the story of our Bible, you will know that this is the story of God to his people for all of time. God sends his love not through sentimentality, but through determined fidelity, determined faithfulness and justice and mercy and compassion that never changes despite how dumb God's people are. It seems like a reckless, overachieving sort of love, and it transcends thousands of years of God's people just being absolute plonkers. As they got up to shenanigans in the desert, as they rose up a golden calf to worship it, as they grumbled and complained that maybe they were better off in Egypt, as their kings and rulers led them to worship other gods made with their own hands. God's love was still relentless. It was constant grace-giving, constant mercy, constant calling back to him, constant forgiveness of people's dumb actions and broken hearts. And God didn't send his love in hashtags or in thoughts or prayers or supportive but ultimately useless Facebook frame photos. The love from God is not just one-time action, but a ridiculously active patience with the people of Israel, as he called them time and time again to redemption, as he time and time held out his rod and his staff as protection for them, as time and time he showed himself the defender and keeper of Israel. The lamenter knows that despite the circumstances right now, that God is faithful. He has remembered Israel's past. He remembers who God is, and he determines. This is why he can speak of the faithfulness and gracious mercy of God. This is what he remembers, to just hope just a little bit. And how do we love this hope? And how do the commentators love it? As I said, there is this pattern, it seems, in the book of Lamentations where this hope is the peak, the pinnacle of what happens. All the stuff that goes before is, hope is great, and everything that happens afterwards, well. And there is argument over whether this hope is this most glorious thing in the whole book or something that actually needs to be a little bit more nuanced. That the lamenter doesn't come and now have this great change of vision of everything that happens to him, but actually it's like a quiet, solid memory in his heart. Because remember this quote from Downtown again. Hope is a tease designed to prevent us from accepting reality. If this was the crux of Lamentations, these verses about hope, then what do we do with the rest of Lamentations? Do we just ignore it? Who cares what happens? God is faithful. It's all gonna be fine. Perhaps this is the reason that these are the verses we know from Lamentations. Perhaps we want to live here in hope because it's so much easier to look at that and grasp hold onto this than it is to know what to do with the other stuff on the other sides of the hope. And I'm not trying to antagonize you or berate you. I'm not. I promise you, I'm just wrestling with this idea that we can jump to Jesus being Christus Victor, that Jesus is here now and everything has been made new and good and right. Because when I look around at the world around me and I look at these empty seats in this empty church I'm preaching to, everything is not good and right. But if this is what we know about God, that he is faithful and graciously merciful, then how the hang does the world look like this? What does it mean for us as Christians, as God's people, as we live in between these promises? These promises of the good that is now and is coming, but the pain that is this world. Because it is true that we should and need to have this strong and solid hope in God who is faithful and merciful. This unfailingly loving God who was so relentless in his passion for us and putting his creation back together that he sent his son Christ. But what do we do when we look around at our world? How do we affirm such a great hope while holding on to the reality of this life? How do we stop ourselves from clinging so hard to the hope of the good that we become disengaged and uncaring of all that is not yet? And there is a lot that is not yet. The answer is, like the lamenter, we have to affirm both. Remember, there is 19 verses about everything that is wrong and a few verses about what is right, and then a whole lot more in chapter 3 about what is wrong again. We have to affirm both. And in doing so, we don't wash or limit the other one. We don't wash away the pain by holding on to hope. And we don't wash away hope if we acknowledge the pain. Both exist in their entirety, and both challenge us, and both challenge each other. If we trivialize the pain, and we only live in the hope of these little cluster of verses in Lamentations 3, ignoring everything else, we forget that the poet still has to walk in pain. There is a city that is not fixed. His hope, then, is not fixed, but it is a moment's peace, a moment's calm in his storm. And if we, as God's people in the now and not yet, rush to this beautiful picture of Revelation and to this hope of this triumphant Jesus, then we do the same. We trivialize the pain and brokenness of this world, and we begin to isolate ourselves out as God's people and as individuals and family. We wash our hands of what's going on and say, well, if it's not all right, it's not the end, and Jesus is going to make it right, so off you go, Jesus. This can leave us happy, but it leaves us untethered and uninvolved in the world which we are called to be salt and light to, when we were supposed to be witnesses to God who comes to serve and renew and to win back. We are called to be not distant but present. We are called to be the witness and the road signs towards Christ. And you know how I love the book of John. And in John 11 we get the story of Jesus, of Lazarus, and Mary and Martha. And I think it holds this paradox of how we live in pain and promise so well. Jesus, of course, knows eventually and exactly what's going to happen. He knows how the story ends. And when he gets the news that at Bethany Lazarus has died, he seems to stay and linger and have conversation with his disciples. And in verse 11, he says to his mates, his disciples, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I will go and awaken him." And eventually he gets to Bethany, and he has this comforting word with Martha, who knows the hope of resurrection, but still is gutted. Martha, whose only brother that we know of in the Bible, is gone. Where does this leave her? Her economic status and her safety. She is gutted, and she is willing to ask Jesus to bring back her brother. Jesus then goes on to see Mary, her other sister. Mary, who is weeping, and Jesus weeps with her. And Jesus is most certainly saddened by Lazarus' death. Jesus wept, it says, maybe the most famous and favourite memory verse of everybody, John 11:35. The incarnation of God with us meant that Jesus fully and deeply experienced pain and suffering. But there's more to it than this. John 11:33 and John 11:38 are often translated to say that he was deeply moved. And we read it by deeply moved by grief. But our English language and translation waters this down. This kind of noise, this deeply movingness, was like a snort, like a horse, I don't know, that prepares to go and charge, like this kind of anger and frustration all rolled up into something. And this kind of noise, this outburst, can be anger, and it was interpreted as grief and emotional pain and sympathy. And the New Living Translation, if you've got one, says that it is a deep anger welled up within him. And in 11:38, that Jesus was angry as he arrived at the tomb. Since the Gospels really tell us how Jesus felt about anything, this portrayal of his emotions is striking and significant for us. We have a window into how Jesus feels about suffering and death of his beloved friend, of someone who was well beloved, of someone who was economic and safety for his sisters. And in this we see Jesus who has a deep and complicated mixture of sadness and anger. Jesus is angry towards death, towards this enemy who has so brazenly robbed this family and him of Lazarus. His emotion, his great grief and sorrow is not aimed at anything but what has taken away and captured Lazarus. His aims, his anger at sin and suffering and death, and to all the enemies that threaten to overthrow this world. Jesus is righteousness, and Jesus is righteous in his rage. He is fighting mad and furious about what is hurting his creation, about what is hurting his beloved, and he goes on and does something about it. Lazarus is called out of the tomb. Now, I haven't yet got that authority over death, but I like the action of Mary and Martha and Jesus in this little chapter. Martha knows the hope of resurrection that is coming, but still weeps and cries for her brother and calls for God to intervene. Mary is just done. She is weeping. She knows that Jesus could have done something and believes that he could still do something, and she expresses this to him: "If you were here, my brother wouldn't have died." Jesus, knowing the final outcome, still comforts her. Jesus, knowing the final outcome, still weeps with her and for Lazarus. Jesus, knowing the final outcome, is still angry, still filled with sadness, and still full of anger about what has become and what has been broken. Our hope then is not found in the hanging out of this, making all things new that will come in the end. Our hope is not settled in this prospect of a happy afterlife, but the experience of a faithful God who is faithfully with us within every experience, who even knowing the end still cried. As we journey with him, we are in the state of grace with God in the throes of agony, with God in the throes and pangs of pain, with God as we don't know what is going on. This is the true gift of hope, that is God with us and for us. God who is given to be with us and for us. The Jesus that we know from John 11 knew the final outcome and still wept. He was still angry, he still gave compassion, he still acted. Jesus was faithful to hope in the pain. Jesus was not afraid or unaware of pain. He was not immune to it, nor was he cowed by it. In John 11, we see how we live out this paradox between pain and promise. We have the example of Mary and of Martha and of Jesus. This is the example of how to live among the paradox of pain and the promise that we know is coming. It is not easy. It is not actionless. To live in this world doesn't mean that we are griefless or angerless, but nor does it mean that we are hopeless, for we know the character of who God is. It is not easy. And the tension between these lines of how God can you be this when I around my world see pain? God, how can you be faithful when I around my world see helplessness and hopelessness? How, God? It is a wrestle. And I think every now and every time and every now and again we're going to kind of shift between those. But it's not just living in hope and being like, sweet, it's all going to be great. Woo, who cares? Later, let's just get to heaven. Or sitting in grief and wondering what to do. But knowing that we actually live between the tension of those two things. Like a dad or a mum or a great favourite auntie being pulled on by both sides of those little kiddies. We are pulled in two directions, but we remain somewhere in the middle. Church, it's hard to hold on to hope when we see the world around us so painfully broken. And it's hard to hold onto that brokenness when we know there is hope. In the tension and with the full knowledge of who God is, of what he has done and as his character, there we find home.